I'm Nicole James. I work at Northern Illinois University. I think chemistry is the coolest thing because everything is chemistry. Chemistry sits in the sciences in this really interesting place. It fundamentally explains all of matter, what matter is and how it behaves, how it does. And we happen to live in a world where we are matter and we're constantly interacting with matter. So, if you're excited about being like, oh, hey, you see that thing over there, I know why that acts like that. The chemistry really has like the broadest basis for being able to do that.
So what do you do in your day-to-day work being a
Right.
chemistry expert?
As a postdoc, usually you just do research. I have an unusual postdoc in that I both do research and I teach one chemistry class per year. And that's because my research is really focused on chemistry education. So in my PhD, I did research that was more, what you often think of when you think of somebody who's doing chemistry research. They're like in a lab and they're mixing things together and they're taking measurements. So I did materials chemistry in my PhD, and I was always really interested in teaching. And so the research that I'm doing now is more focused on how do people learn chemistry. And so that's a type of research within sort of the broad umbrella of chemistry called chemistry education research.
So when you did, you were working on your doctorate then. So what would that type of chemistry apply to?
The particular thing that I worked on was, you might be familiar with actually this demo. If you mix a bunch of cornstarch and water to make something that sometimes people call oobleck, and it's unique because if you stir it really slowly, it's really fluid-like, sort of just like water. But if you stir it really quickly, it becomes very solid-like, and that's unusual. Usually you don't think the harder I stir this thing or the rougher that I treat this thing, the stronger it will become. Usually the rougher you treat something, the weaker it becomes. We were studying why that phenomenon happens. There's a bunch of different ways that this is applicable. So people in industry care about this a lot because if you imagine you're like, working in a factory, you're pumping slurries from here to there to try to produce something. If your slurries solidify as they go around like a U-joint or something, that could be catastrophic for the industry. So there's sort of an industry application that people care about. There's a technological application that people care about, which is that if you have body armor like Kevlar is really good at stopping bullets, but it's actually really bad at stopping stab injuries. And so this material that we were working with, people try to impregnate Kevlar fabrics with it to give it stab resistance. And physicists care about this a lot because we actually have, from a fundamental physics perspective, we don't understand why it works. So it was sort of a fun thing to work on because you get to do industry applications, you get to do technology applications, and you get to do fundamental, why does this work type science.
When you're younger, maybe when you're a kid, you think that science has it all figured out, like they've already answered all of the big questions.
Yeah.
And then you start to see that there's so many areas of research.
I think that's a really important point because often, like when you're in high school or even when you're in college, science is presented to you as like, we know this is how this thing works. Like you get to hear all the success stories after, people spent years and years and years arguing over this fact. We've sort of reached consensus now, and that's what you often learn in science classes. But most of science is really about trying to figure out how things work, and it's asking questions. So like just from that example from my PhD, one of the things that was so difficult was that there's two factions and they have different theories about why this works, and so it's a big fight in the community. And one of the factions says that it's all about friction, that you have particles that are mixed in a fluid, and if the particles get close to each other when you're stirring, they can interact frictionally. And the whole fight between the people that thought it was friction and the people that thought it was something else was fundamentally because we still don't really understand how friction works.
You're a chemist. What are you doing working with physicists?
So my PhD, I don't know if the structure of grad school is worth talking about, but in grad school, it's sort of different from undergrad. In undergrad, you take classes and maybe you do research. But in graduate school, you're really there for research. And in chemistry, at least, you work for an advisor, sort of like your boss. Like you'll often hear graduate students in chemistry refer to their boss. And really, that's the professor that they're doing research with. That professor runs a lab and lots of people are in that lab and they're all doing research. My advisor was actually appointed in the physics department because we were working on really material science. And material science, some schools will have their own material science or materials engineering department, and then professors would be appointed there. But a lot of schools, like UChicago, the school that I went to for my graduate work, they don't have a material science department, and you'll find that it's a really interdisciplinary field. So sometimes you'll have chemists doing material science, and sometimes you'll have physicists doing material science. I thought the work that they were doing was really interesting, and I thought that there was a lot of overlap with, they were doing physics, and you could have done a lot of this stuff through a chemistry perspective. And so I joined that group to do some of that work.
We've talked a little bit about those big questions that still haven't been answered. Is that one of the reasons that you got into a science field, or what was your path like to get to where you are?
I started doing chemistry because I loved my teachers. I had a really good high school chemistry teacher, and I really liked taking classes from him. I didn't actually take chemistry my first year of college, but I had friends that took chemistry, and they really loved the teachers. And so that made me want to take those classes because it seemed like, the teachers were exciting. They were talking about interesting concepts. And I just kept liking the teachers that I took enough chemistry that I eventually appreciated that chemistry was cool in its own right. So you don't have to be in a lab to be a scientist. I would take a liberal view of what counts as a scientist. And I would say that if you're ever engaging in a scientific practice, then you're a scientist. And a scientific practice can happen in the lab because you're doing a laboratory experiment, or it can happen out in the field because you're observing animals, or you're observing a land structure and engaging in a scientific process to try to explain this mountain range that you see or this bird's behavior. For me, sort of like my laboratory equivalent is the classroom and what students are doing and saying in the classroom.
What, if any, barriers did you find when you were starting to pursue science?
I feel like I got really lucky that I ended up pursuing science in a lot of ways. It wasn't until I went to graduate school that I really ever made, I feel like, a conscious choice that, I'm going to pursue science as a career. I went to a liberal arts college, and liberal arts colleges, I think, probably let you avoid trying to make career large decisions a little bit more than maybe other institutions, because the whole idea is that you're taking a lot of different classes and learning things in a lot of different ways. So you can understand the world in a particular way through reading literature, and you can understand the world in a particular way through your science classes, and you can understand the world in a particular way through math classes. And so it really encourages you to explore more broadly. And I was a double major in German studies. So I took a bunch of German language and literature courses and chemistry. And it really wasn't until going to graduate school when I had to make a conscious decision about if I was going to do chemistry or German. So I don't know. I mean, there's other barriers, but I think a big one to like making the decision, it was the fact that STEM had fewer barriers than the other fields that I was interested in studying. I'm a first generation college student. My parents didn't go to college, and I worked to support myself through college. So there was also a lot of barriers about that for college in general. And I'm not sure if they're, to some extent, I think STEM complicates some of them. If you're working to support yourself and you have lab every afternoon, then you're doing your homework late at night. If you're at an institution where that's not normal for, most students might not be working, then if your course is graded on a curve, you're being compared against students that have a lot more time to put forward towards their studies, and that can be challenging.
How did you overcome that? Do you have advice for people who might be doing that, working while putting themselves through school?
When I look back on it, the reason why I succeeded anyway was because I worked with people. I wasn't trying to do all my homeworks by myself. I wasn't trying to understand everything by myself. Like I said, I went to a liberal arts college, so it was small classes. So you got a lot more individual interaction with the professors. It was maybe less scary to go to office hours. And I did know my professors really well. And so, really using the people around you as a resource. Professors, obviously, but also, doing your homework in study groups with other friends. There will be things that you'll really get, and then you'll explain it to them, and you'll learn it even better by having had to explain it. And there'll be things that you'll get stuck on that other people will get, and they'll be able to explain to you. It saves you a lot of time when you're studying, which is, really important if you're working 20 hours a week also. But it also helps you learn the material so much deeper when you have to explain it to somebody else. Right? Like we talk about how, teachers say that they never really understood it until they started teaching it. Well, if you study with people and you're trying to explain it to them, you're giving yourself a little bit of that, I understand it better because I'm trying to teach it to my friend.
I think there is also a misconception that people either have a very science-oriented personality and brain, or they have more of a creative brain, And I think it's interesting what you're saying about liberal arts colleges and giving you the opportunity to explore. Are there connections between the two? Do you see yourself as a creative person?
I don't see myself as an artist person because I don't think that I don't have very like many artistic skills. I would like to, I just don't. I think that creativity can take a lot of forms. I really loved my German studies degree. It was a really hard decision. After my undergrad, I sort of had to choose one. You can't really double major in grad school, at least not in fields that dissimilar. And it was a really difficult choice for me. And I think that both of them have been really, really useful. A lot of people will ask me like, oh, German and chemistry, what a weird combination. You know, why did you ever do that? And I'm frequently like, I'm so glad I did because I learned so many things through doing my German degree that have been useful in my chemistry work. So I always kind of think of it as my superpower, that my German degree is my superpower because you know, when you get to grad school, in chemistry, you have to write papers, you have to write manuscripts that present your work to other people. And for all my friends that, you know, went to Wisconsin-Madison and they majored in chemistry, they maybe took one literature class when they were a freshman and then they never took a reading and writing class ever again. So they hadn't written to like communicate to somebody, you know, in 3, 4, 5 years if they took time off between grad school and undergrad. And so it was really difficult for them, whereas I had continued to do it every year through my German classes. And so it was a skill that I had really developed through them that was, I think, very advantageous because, you know, you can do the most amazing science in the world, but if you can't explain it to somebody else and if you can't write that work down and publish it, nobody's going to read it and nobody's going to know.
So what types of industries or businesses would hire someone with a specialization in chemistry or in chemistry education?
I sort of know two different sides of this. So my husband is also a chemist. We met in grad school and he went the industry path and I went the education path. So there's lots of different things you can do with a chemistry degree, either at the bachelor's level or at the doctoral level. The way that programs will often categorize the paths are that you have the industry path and the academic path. And those are like the two biggest ones, but there's a lot of other stuff out there as well. You just have to do a bit more looking for it. The industry path is sort of like going to work for a company. So my husband works at Intel. He manages the tools, the machines that build semiconductors that get put into processors for the company. And so there's a lot of skills that he learned in grad school that transfer to how you maintain those instruments. And if he had a slightly different job, maybe he would have one that's more research focused, like within how Intel develops their own processors. So that's an industry option. The advantages of industry is they tend to pay you way more. The academic branch, so if you wanted to be like a research professor or a community college professor or a liberal arts professor or an instructor or, you know, academic staff, those would all be academic paths that you could take. And the advantage of those is typically that, you know, at the end of the day, my husband's work has to benefit Intel. And if you go for academics, you have a bit more freedom in choosing what you want to do. So I chose that I wanted to study education research and I want my work to benefit students, but you know, I could have stayed with my bench research and been like, I want my research to develop, you know, new understandings of fluid dynamics that are going to benefit whatever applications I'm interested in. And as long as, you know, you can get a professorship and you can get funding to do that, then you can do whatever you want. So some people often say that they like academia because there's more intellectual freedom in what you're going to do. The pay is lower. I think the work is more interesting. That's why I chose it. But those are the two main branches. And then if you're more of a creative person, there's lots of options about, like, you could work for a journal and be an editor or a science writer, or you know, you could work for PBS and things like that.